Hi everyone, my name is Brooke Tillotson, and today I'm going to talk about non-parametric trends and historical environmental data and harmful algal bloom initiation relationships in Western Lake Erie. First, I'd like to thank CIGLR and GLERL for running the program, as well as my mentors, Meena, Raju, and David Cannon from CIGLR, and Mark Rowe and Peter Alsip from NOAA GLERL, and lastly, the program coordinators, Mary and Margaret, and all of the staff that presented during our seminar series. A little bit about me. So I just recently graduated from the Colorado School of Mines with my master's in hydrology. I worked with Eric Anderson on assessing projected riverine and lakeshore heat waves in the Great Lakes region. I presented at CIGLR this year, and we really enjoyed that rug on the floor. And then I'm starting my PhD at the University of Portsmouth in the UK this fall, looking at the environmental effectiveness of shore power port decarbonization. So the research question that evolved over the summer was, are environmental drivers related to bloom initiation timing in Western Lake Erie? And so we first started off looking at the long-term trends in environmental data in Western Lake Erie, and then followed that up with which and to what extent are environmental variables related to bloom initiation timing. Let's start off with some previous research on trends. So there's been linear increases in lake water surface temperature of about 0.5 degrees Celsius per decade and about 1% per year for wave power. And there's also, this is as of 2015, but total and dissolved phosphorus has increased since the 1990s due to increases in Maumee River discharge. And then looking at bloom initiation, McGuire et al. 2024 use, which I know like pretty much everyone who's on this paper is in this room, but they use hierarchical Bayesian generalized additive model to determine bloom start date from GLERL station particulate microcystin data. And also Del Judas et al. 2021 found that the midsummer bloom onset was associated with about 1 month of water temperatures above 20 degrees Celsius. So let's start with our first question, looking at some of the long-term trends in environmental data in Western Lake Erie. And so first off, why did we choose non-parametric for our statistical analysis? It doesn't assume a data distribution, which was really great for us because a lot of this environmental data we were looking at was not normally distributed. We used two main tests. The first was the Mann-Kendall's test. We used tau, which measures the monotony of a slope between two variables, and also the Tillotson slope, which calculates the median of slopes between each pair of data points and is more resistant to outliers. Starting off looking at this figure, this is the 75th percentile of wind speed trends from 2012 to 2021. This period I'm showing right now because it overlaps with our bloom initiation analysis study. This is looking at the Mann-Kendall's tau, so we can see that there's a lot of spatial heterogeneity throughout in regards to each of these months. But if we were to focus a little bit more in on May and September, there is more spatial coherence in regards to trends being in the positively increasing direction. If we expand this time series a little bit, we do reduce the number of data points we have, but we can look at from 1990 to 2024. From May to October, and we see that primarily June, August, and October have positively increasing trends. And at what rate are those trends increasing? If we look at June and August, the maximum values are about 0.025 meters per second to year to like 0.05. There's a few other statistically significant variables that we found from our analysis. The first was, once again, water temperature from 1995 to 2024 using the Great Lakes Surface Environmental Average Analysis regional average for Western Lake Erie. And that had about a slope of 0.38 degrees Celsius per year. Downward short radiation from 1990 to 2023 increased at about 0.5 watts per meter squared per year. And this data product, which I'll explain a little bit more after, from 2008 to 2022 actually negatively increased over this time period, which makes sense because a lot of those higher severity events were front loaded in this time series, like 2011 and 2015. Okay, moving on to the more fun stuff. So what variables are associated with earlier or later bloom initiation dates? And so the first question is, did we define annual bloom initiation? And so first, we obtained annual start dates for each GLERL Western Lake Erie station from McGuire et al. Based on particulate microcystin. These are all of the stations that they used, and what I did was for each year, each station had a start date. I averaged across the start date to get one per year. And then I found the average across all years to calculate the onset anomaly for each year. So that's basically the number of days each year started from the average across the 2012 to 2021 period. And And then we used a few different predictor variables. The first one was peak CI. This was from NOAA NCOS. It was the annual peak cyanobacteria index in Western Lake Erie for each year. Also, I aggregated across the Western Lake Erie NDVC stations to find the daily 75th percentile of wind speed. I used the NOAA GLC product to get the daily regional average for lake water surface temperature in Western Lake Erie. And then for phosphorus, we used two different variables. First was a daily load of total phosphorus, just focused on March through July, and then also the cumulative March through July total bioavailable phosphorus product. And so there's going to be three hypotheses that will kind of guide us through the rest of this presentation. The first one we hypothesized was that warmer spring lake water surface temperature is associated with earlier bloom initiation dates. The second is that the higher March through July cumulative TBP loads are associated with earlier bloom initiation dates. And the third is that periods of higher wind prior to bloom initiation are associated with earlier bloom initiation dates. If we first look at lake water surface temperature, we have degree days on the x-axis, and we calculated this by just looking at March through June so that each year time period was normalized, and that is the sum of the each day's excess over 15 degrees Celsius. And then we have bloom initiation date anomaly on the y-axis, with positive values being later timings, earlier values being negative values. And each are colored by their peak CI value. We can see here that the data is a little noisy and we really can't determine any specific trends, but what is interesting is we can see that in cooler springs, there typically is then those higher peak CI values. If we now focus onto the cumulative March through July TBP load on the x-axis, we already know that it is associated or used for HAB severity prediction. That's what the product that is forecasted every summer uses. But from this graph, we can interpret that it is not as useful for bloom initiation date estimation. But a little bit more useful phosphorus index to look at is the date that the March through July total phosphorus load from the Maumee River discharge reaches 50% of its delivery, which we use because it was the center of mass. Okay, so these are sized by their TBP, which is that cumulative product. So we can see that at later deliveries of that center of mass, we do see then the higher cumulative TBP product, and there's no distinct relationship with temperature once again here. But here, this is a little bit more useful to look at, and we can start to think, looking at this figure, we see that these peak CI values tend to be lower when this 50% load is delivered earlier in the season. So we can ask, do blooms use nutrients earlier in less favorable conditions when it's cooler in the spring, when the light intensity is lower, and that is possibly leading to then a lower overall peak severity index? And then moving on to wind speed, this is colored by degree days, and this was the days above 7.7 meters per second from, I think, Winky Badanda 2019. It was just a good threshold to use for mixing of the Western Lake Erie water column. And we can see here that as the number of days over this wind speed threshold increases, typically then the bloom initiation date anomaly occurs earlier in the year. So let's go over our hypotheses again. So we weren't able to really make any strong determinations regarding lake water surface temperature. And then the March through July cumulative TBP loads, we were not able to find a succinct relationship with, but was interesting that looking at the total phosphorus load, the 50% delivery from the Maumee River, we're able to see that the later that 50% is delivered, the later the bloom typically occurs. And that periods of higher wind prior to the bloom initiation were indeed associated with an earlier bloom initiation date. Of course, this is a very small data set, so nothing entirely certain. We also performed a multiple linear regression analysis. So we have our three predictor variables that we talked about here, and we did that in response to the onset anomaly. We were able to find that 89% of variance in the onset anomaly was explained by the predictor variables. We did that at a 95% confidence interval. And from that, we can see that every unit increase in like the delay in timing of the total phosphorus resulted in 0.39 days later. That was confident at the 90th percent confidence interval. And that every unit increase in degree days resulted in a 0.18 days earlier in an onset anomaly. And the most significant one was that every unit increase in number of days over 7.7 meters per second resulted in a 4.34 days earlier anomaly in this analysis. What I think is kind of interesting here, and I really wish I had my notes to talk about this a little bit more succinctly, but we can really start to see the complexity of trying to pull apart these variables. So for example, 2020 had much higher wind, it had a higher degree day index, and also the phosphorus was delivered earlier than all of those other variables and resulted in an earlier initiation date, but a much lower peak CI. And then if we were to compare 2015 to 2017, both of these had a little bit similar peaks. 2015 was definitely higher, but they differed in their wind, for example, and also degree days a little bit. And that could have possibly been the reason for different onset anomalies. But definitely a lot more work is needed and a longer data set to really pick apart the contributions of each of these input variables. Getting into our conclusions, like I just talked about, there's a lot of antagonistic and confounding variables. For example, maybe a year is more stormy, which is resulting in more resuspension events, but then again, it could be cooler, which might lead to faster growth rates, for example. The March through July TBP load was good for severity prediction, but not as well for bloom initiation prediction. And then using a multiple linear regression analysis, 89% of the bloom onset anomaly variance was explained by the predictor variables. So future steps, of course, expanding the time series, more data is usually better to work with. And then seeing how wind-driven resuspension events trigger bloom initiation using FVCOM output. And it would be really interesting to compare that output to the statistical model to see how they could be then combined for bloom initiation date estimations. And finally, looking at how these statistical models could be used to leverage future field monitoring efforts. So some key takeaways, we do see increasing trends in certain months. We see that those three predictor variables explained 89% of the onset anomaly variance, and that definitely more analysis is needed to separate each variable's contribution to bloom initiation timing, especially thinking about the complexity of favorable conditions. So thank you very much for your time. Oh, I'm good now. I already presented. I'm good. Oh, yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brooke. And we've got a few minutes for questions. Okay. You're keeping Margaret on her toes.
Thanks, great job. And it confirms a lot of what we are thinking anyways. By any chance with the winds, did you look at direction of wind and see if that was an influence at all?
I started looking into directionality and then didn't include that in the final analysis, but that was definitely something I wanted to do. Yeah.
Hi, Brooke. Great talk. Really interesting stuff. I'd wondered if you had looked at, Alan had this paper, Alan here at CIGLR, who worked with Casey, where they used a Bayesian additive regressive tree model. I don't think they were looking at the onset. I think they were looking at, Casey would know better than me, but they were looking, I think, at just the overall kind of explanatory power of all the variables. And one of the really interesting outcomes from that paper was they found that in the growing phase, the temperature was the least important variable. So I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, but I'm just curious if you had looked at that other work and had any thoughts about that contrast. And it's okay if not, I just am interested in that. Like, I wonder how we square these results with the ones from Alan's paper is kind of where my head is.
Was that the one that came out last year, right?
I think so. Does that sound right? Alan's paper? But right? Yeah.
Okay. I know the one, I think he worked on that one as well with Craig and stuff. And I talked with Craig and he sent me the start dates from I think that analysis. But I didn't think too much about the temperature in regard to that paper specifically.
Thank you for doing this work. I'm going to, not being a HABs expert myself, I'm going to draw the analogy, or I am drawing the analogy that these conditions make it more optimal for the bloom to grow, right? So that's what is affecting when the bloom starts. How do you think this might correlate to bloom intensity or bloom toxicity? I.e., would these variables also, how are they correlated to what happens throughout the season, or how large the peak is, et cetera?
Yeah, at the beginning of the project, we did decide to not really focus or look into severity at all, but in discussing it, I think it would be interesting to see how resuspension events further into the summer would be related to kind of upkeeping bloom severity, and just that was something we wanted to do, but we didn't have the data to really look into the FECOM output to look into that a little bit more. So. Meena, hopefully you can work on that.
Really a good next step to look at and see how it's kind of impacting the severity. But yes, we will look at it.
Yeah, so very nice work. So first, I just want to know what's the meaning of degrade day? Is it a threshold?
Yeah, so I feel like every time I explain it, I explain it in a different way, but we looked at from March through June, each day saw that the difference above 15 degrees Celsius and summed up those numbers. So if it was under 15 degrees Celsius, that day was just a zero value.
Okay. Okay. So, and the second question is that it's unusual that algal blooms, are corresponding to high winds. So, do you know the mechanism? Typically, high winds can inhibit algal bloom.
Yeah, so I guess in this analysis, I didn't we originally were trying to look at the like lag times between high wind events and blooms, but we decided just for the short time for analysis we had to normalize it by just having this one value of a threshold value. But it would definitely be interested to see the lag times instead, because I think I learned a lot about how calmer conditions are more related to better blooms.
Yeah.
Worse
Okay,
blooms.
thank you.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay. All right. So thank you so much, Brooke. Wonderful talk.